Welcome to this episode of the Embryo Advocates podcast. Today, I am joined by Dr. Carrie Gress, and she is someone that I really admire because of her incredible work. She's someone who is a Christian, she's a mother and a wife, and she also has spent an awful lot of time studying the history of feminism. Dr. Gress, would you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and the work that you have done?
Yeah. So I'm a mother of five. I did a PhD in philosophy. I finished it shortly after my third child was born, and I've decided to stay home with my kids. So I've done some unusual kind of things, mainly landed in the book publishing world, which has been a really great option for our family, so that I am able to be home with my children as much as possible. But yeah, I kind of stumbled upon feminism. I didn't really in any way intend to target it, but when I started really looking back in the about 10 years ago, I started looking at women and what was happening in the culture. And I just realized, this isn't really being discussed, and the role that feminism plays, and really just looking at the philosophical ideas that underpin it. And so initially, my first book that came out in 2018 was called The Anti-Mary Exposed: Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. And that book really, I think, was an outlier in the conversation because nobody was really talking about this at that point. And I think as the years have progressed, people have been more and more open to looking at feminism as a negative thing instead of just a positive thing. I think that's kind of been the gloss over feminism, as it's just about helping women and not really realizing that it's got a rotten core. And so I've just continued to dig deeper in that. And Something Wicked is my 11th book. Most of them are not about feminism, but three of them are. And Yeah, I think the conversation just continues to open up, and it's been really surprising, especially since even the book that I published in 2023, which is called The End of Women, that there are places talking about this as an issue that never were open to it before and didn't see it as an issue. And I think people are beginning to say and see, that feminism is really distorting and has had a distorting effect on the culture, and are open to talking about it. So it's been great to be, both. I've been in this long enough that I really understand the roots of it, especially given my background in philosophy. But also it's exciting to see the newer, more superficial trends of the direction in which people are going. That seems a lot healthier than where we've been.
Absolutely. And I think you're such an interesting person, Dr. Gress, because there is a characterization in our culture that if you're against feminism, that you fall into a particular box.
Yeah.
They would typically say that someone who's against feminism must be against women being educated, against women having professional accomplishments, and your
Mhm.
life is the complete opposite. You have this doctorate in philosophy. You've spent a very extensive amount of time studying at the graduate level, the philosophy in general. So you're very highly qualified to examine philosophy because of your background. And also, it's really amazing to see what you have accomplished in your career and then to go through all that and say, I want to prioritize my family and spend as much time with them as I can, because I think your life becomes a message against feminism as well, not only your books, because then you say, well, sure, because of this incredible study you've done and the degree you have, you could be paid an awful lot of money as a, philosophy professor, and you could have all of the things that come with that. And you have decided to prioritize your family, which is incredible. So I think for people who are listening in, especially those who are skeptical of anyone who challenges feminism, I think your life is really inspiring. And so I think we'll
Thank you.
talk today. I mean, because your book does examine quite a few things, like our assumptions. The book I'm referring to is Something Wicked, your latest book. You have a section in the book where you talk about this idea that we think educating women is a feminist idea, but it's not. There's a lot of educating women that occurred before feminism was on the scene. And since feminism has come on the scene, many of the effective forms of women's education, you point out, like many nuns have devoted themselves not in the name of feminism, but in the name of Christianity to educating women. So I have had a lot of interesting conversations with people about feminism, and this podcast is focused on the pro-life movement. And there's quite an encounter with the feminist ideology over and over and over again, because some people who are pro-life believe the only way that we can end abortion is we have to be more feminist, and we have to take this particular view on feminism in order to end abortion. And I'm not with them in that conclusion. However, what I've heard from them is they say, well, if you are against feminism, then it falls into the red pill. Now you're having a red pill view, but I think what happens is I would be curious to hear your thoughts about this. I think that there is kind of like a line we could look at of like different views on men and women. And there's a very far extreme with men who are against women that are on the red pill. And there's a very far extreme of women who believe that the only way to have value and to be important in the world is to be a feminist. I think those are the two far extremes, that we don't have to go to either far extreme, and that we can come into a healthy view from scripture and from Christianity that says, I'm not going over here to this extreme view that women aren't valuable and that men are the only ones that are valuable, or the other opposite extreme that men aren't valuable, only women are valuable, which of course neither of them would admit that that is part of their view.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Do you think that's accurate, that both of them are quite extreme and that we can come to a healthy middle?
Yeah, no, I think that is a really important question. One of the things that I found that I was really surprised by was this obvious contempt that women have for men in the feminist movement. And this is from really from the very beginning. This wasn't something that just popped up in the last decade or something. So I think that's part of the problem, is that that's one of the kind of core ideas, even though if many people who call themselves feminists don't really actually realize that. But if you start looking at the fabric of the culture, you see this contempt. It's all over. The culture has been saturated with it. It's in our commercials. The dumb guy that doesn't know how to put a diaper on a baby, or all of those kinds of caricatures that we've created and just have accepted in the culture. So I think that is what's been happening, and I think that the what you're terming the red pill, or kind of the negative aspects of the manosphere, are reflecting that contempt that women have had for men. So I think they're reacting to it. But the problem is they're reacting in the exact same way. So they now have the same contempt for women. So it's sort of, like you said, these two bookends, but both of them are the most unhealthy way in which to resolve the issue, because we're not meant to work in isolation. And I think, this is one of the reasons why I've been able to do what I do, is because my husband and I are very focused on what's best for our family, and that changes from year to year, from season to season. But we're working together as a couple with our different sets of complementary gifts, and focused on, what is it God wants for our family, and how do we move forward in that, in a way that helps everyone, instead of it just being about my career or his career. And I think that's an important piece too, is that we somehow have this expectation that we can always follow our dreams. But even in talking with my husband, I know there are certain jobs he would love to have, absolutely would love to have, and are within his grasp. But because he has a family, he doesn't take them because of the hours, or the time commitment, or the other responsibilities that he have that would take him away from us. And so I think that's an important piece of this, is to recognize that we're not meant to be in this place where our career trumps everything else. And I think that's a important piece of being in the middle, of understanding the role that certainly God has in our lives, and what it is that He's calling us to. So in any event, I hope, was there something I missed? You had a lot of pieces that were really connected well together, but I think that's the main thread is really recognizing this prioritization of self over others. And that's, fundamentally not the way you're going to win at life. The way in which we're most happy, the where we have a sense of flourishing and joy, is in self-gift. And that doesn't mean, something where you wash yourself out, or where you're somehow being taken advantage of, but it means working with your spouse, and working with God, and working with your children, in a way that everybody's flourishing. It's that idea of the common good, that unfortunately has been really misunderstood as well. So, yeah, I think it feels like a difficult problem, because you have to actually depend on other people. And I think this is what's hard about feminism, is it's taught us to believe that we can really just depend on ourselves, and that's really where fulfillment's going to come from. When in fact, it's actually quite the opposite. It's actually in surrender and in gift of self, that's ultimately where the truest fulfillment comes from, in our lives.
I totally agree with you that self-giving is really the path to meaning in our lives. I think
Mhm.
one of the most interesting experiments in feminism in our current culture is DINK, dual income, no kids.
Mhm.
And I have observed some people like this, and they do not have the limitation you were describing that your husband experiences, where he's got to I acknowledge that he's capable of certain careers and he has to not enter into them right now because you're focusing on your children and being there for them. So people who choose to contracept and they go dual income, no kids, maybe even use abortion to accomplish that, destroy their own children to have this goal to never have children and focus only on the adults in the relationship. And it's so interesting because those people might have the career that they want. They might have the job title they've always sought. They might have a bank account filled with $1 million. Maybe that's a goal they set for themselves. Like, we're going to just be very wealthy at a young age and we're going to have all these things we do and we're going to, make a life of meaning in this way. And something I have noticed about the Dinks is that they give it 10 years, they give it 15 years, or even more. Maybe it takes longer. And many of them look around and they say, I had the title I wanted at work. I have $1 million in my bank account. I have this and that and the other accomplishment. I have this advanced degree, and I am so miserable because
Right.
when there isn't self-giving, even if you've built something big and even if you think you have all this wealth and all these accomplishments, that lack of self-giving and that lack of building meaningful relationships will come back to bite you. And I think dinks are such a picture of that in our culture. It's very interesting how feminism has led to dink.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And that idea of if we've got these goals set for ourselves and we put so much weight in the sense of what we think they're going to do for us, and then you achieve them, and there's this, realization that this isn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And I think it's a real tragedy, in fact, more than anything, the fact that we've allowed people to somehow think that this is really what life is meant to be, and that, our goals are supposed to be focused on self and achievement and whatnot. And it also, I think, points to just a real um, brokenness in our understanding of what it means to be human, I think. And you mentioned obviously the importance of relationships. We see that role of relationship certainly still active in women. Only now it's with animals, or as pets, as kind of taking that role of children. Plants are now the new thing. Plant parenthood is the new thing. So the desire is still there, and you can but it's gets so twisted because it becomes then about control and power, kind of this distorted, not necessarily among plants or pets, but we see that in boardrooms and across the board in terms of workplaces. Women who have not ordered their emotions properly, because they've been told that it's about power and control, end up really doing a lot of damage instead of bringing life to a place. And that is why I think one of the things that has been so lost is this understanding of woman as mother or as a life giver, and not just biologically, but that we're meant to do this in all aspects of our life, of improve the lives of others, of help others reach their potential. And instead it sort of collapsed in on self. And so I think that's the tragedy, is you're not really going to be able to develop the character that you want or that you admire in others when you're focused on self instead of what it is that we're fundamentally called to do. And it's in that ironically women become most beautiful, they become most compelling, they become the people that everybody wants to be around, when we develop those characteristics instead of this kind of black hole of self-regard. And that's the tragedy of it, is that you're not only are you blocking yourself off from the children that you might be called to have, but you're also breaking the relationships that you're meant to have, whether it's in the workplace or among your family, your extended family, or even just in your community. So I think that's the real problem, is that we seal ourselves off from those areas that we're really meant to flourish in.
That's so true. Choosing not to be open to life has really just deprived many women of incredible blessing. I
Mhm.
once watched this documentary about contraception, and I'm a Protestant. It was made by Protestants talking about, oh, Protestants are very into contraception and we think it's so great. And this woman was talking about how when she first got married, it was a great fear was having children. Like, oh my goodness, this is going to change my life so drastically. It's going to change my marriage. It's going to be awful. And then they eventually had kids about 10 years later. And then she had this realization. She said, God was planning sanctification for me through these children. And
Mhm.
what sanctification had I missed out on? as a result of saying, no, God, no, God, no, I don't want any kids. Because God gives kids as such a gift of love. They're not, I guess, some kind of punishment to destroy your life. But feminism has taught us to have this war between the mother and their child. And that's kind of what we're getting to in this conversation. And so, Dr. Gress, there are a lot of views in the pro-life movement on feminism. And I would say, in my personal experience, it seems that most people in the pro-life movement are very in favor of feminism and believe that it's actually key to us ending abortion. So I would love to ask you a question that I know you've been asked before. A very common book that pro-life activists read and state that it kind of proves we can keep feminism or revive feminism and basically fix it and make it a good ideology is the book Subverted by Sue Ellen Browder. So her book has this view that the first wave of feminists were very good feminists, and this is such a great ideology. So what we'll do is we're just going to ignore all the other waves of feminism and say, oh, that got dysfunctional. We have no idea why that became dysfunctional. We'll just ignore it. We're going to blame, these abortionists who quote unquote hijacked the women's movement. What is your view on that? Do you think it's an accurate view of history that the first wave of feminism was so pure? Let's go back to that, and we need that to fight against abortion in our culture.
Yeah. No, I think this is a huge question. And Sue Ellen is a friend of mine. She and I have been in conversation about this over the years. And it's been really interesting. I think I admire her deeply because I think she is someone who has done an amazing job of keeping her mind nimble enough that she's open to changing her mind. And so she's actually written about this publicly, that we had this conversation probably about 8 years ago, where she was still trying to push for that idea that the first wave was good, and that we could really turn feminism around into something positive. And I pushed back and said, I don't think it can be done. And I wasn't 100% sure then yet either, but so she writes about this and how she's come to agree with me on that, even though she may have been skeptical at that point. But yeah, I think this has been one of the things that I really encountered. In fact, in my first book on this topic, I said the same thing. I thought the first wave was good. I had been assured by all the right people among conservatives and pro-lifers that it was actually really good. And when I went to write my book called The End of Woman, where I was really chronicling how we've gotten to this place of the trans movement and whatnot, how, we're really, we've taken so much away from women. We've taken away home, we've taken away husbands, we've taken away children, and now we're taking away the body of women. How do we get there? And so I went back to the first wave and really started scrutinizing the work there. And I thought, initially, like, I'll spend 2 days on this because everybody knows the first wave is good, and then I'll move on. Well, now, of course, how many years has that been? 4 years now. I'm still working on the first wave because I've realized very quickly that the first wave was just as problematic. And in fact, it set the real foundation and the groundwork for what you see happen in the second wave. So in any event, I think that's a key piece, is to just understand that feminism from the very beginning has not had the real goals that we attribute to it. We've kind of, again, glossed over it and made it just, it's these women just wanted the vote or whatnot, but we've ignored the things that those women actually said. So you can go back and look very easily. It's all in English. It's all online. The work of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were very explicit in the fact that they believed that we needed a kind of feminism so that we could get rid of Christianity, that Christianity was a tool being used by men to enslave women. And they really believed that what women had experienced before that was a kind of slavery akin to the slaves that were being imported in England and the United States in the slave trade. And, of course, you look at the data and the reality of that, and you realize, especially someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was from a very wealthy family and who had to actually ask her husband for details about what it is that lower class women would be, what they would have grievances about, because she just didn't know. So I think that's one of the really important pieces, is to see how this was very much an effort to undermine the church, any kind of hierarchy in the church, and any kind of real understanding of Christianity as a positive force for womanhood. And of course, we know, there's been no greater religion that's promoted the gifts and attributes and rights of women than Christianity. And so, if you go back and see this is what they were trying to undermine, then suddenly it makes it much harder to see it as something that was pure, or something that was just about civil rights or opportunities and whatnot. And I think that, it's really interesting to even look at the time period that a lot of these women were writing there. Most of them were Protestants from a very specific Unitarian portion of the what you call the church, even though they weren't Unitarians, aren't actually Christians. They don't believe in the Trinity. They don't believe in Christ as a savior. Um, so you can't really even call them Christians, but what their experience was that men had a certain amount of control over women's lives, and women weren't allowed to get an education, and that's where the place from which they're writing. But that's not really what was going on in the broader culture. Certainly not in the United States. You've got Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was the first foundress of a Catholic school in the United States. This is early 1800s. And by the time the century was done, there were 3,500 Catholic schools, largely run by women religious in the United States. So education was really taking off. And you also can see, kind of this connection with the Industrial Revolution as well, where people have disposable income. They have opportunities to be able to be educated in ways they weren't previously because of financial opportunities. So anyway, that's a lot of minutia, to answer your question. But I think when you really start looking at what was going on, it becomes very clear that there was no pure feminism that can be modeled after. It was all really a distorting and continues to be a distorting effort for women today.
Yes. And in your latest book, Something Wicked, you talk about this idea that for many people, feminism is its own faith, its own church. And I
Yeah.
kind of hear you saying, as you describe the differences between Christianity and feminism, that we
Mhm.
can have a women's movement and it's Christianity. And it's not only about women, it's also about the value of men, the value of men, the value of women, the value of children, and that we're all loved and valued by God. So I
Mhm.
think there is a movement that we can have to support the dignity of women. And feminism has failed. It has produced results, like you say in your book. We talk about the fruit of feminism,
Mhm.
what is out there. And you argue in your book, The End of Woman, that the fruit of feminism is, over 60 million abortions, which
Mhm.
should really tell us something if the tree has produced that many, that destruction of children. I mean, we look at what the fruit of Christianity is, and obviously it genuinely changes people's lives. And so, by nature of being Christians, we have a foundation for why women have value, and we have a foundation for why children have value. And it's something that the pro-life movement has had to come back to, because for a few years the pro-life movement, I did see it was kind of trying to secularize, more like, no, look, we can be secular and we can be atheist and pro-life, and which there's truth that atheists can be pro-life because it makes sense to not kill people if you're an atheist
Right.
or if you're a Christian. But I think we've seen in the pro-life movement, as they've tried different ways to fix and heal our culture, that we really need Christianity, because we need a full foundation for why human beings have value and
Mhm.
why life has value. Because one thing that has happened when I would do pro-life outreach is occasionally I reach those philosophers you'll talk to, and they're like, no, but life doesn't have meaning for this reason or that reason or the other reason. And it kind of shows that we need something so much deeper than just, okay, well, we need to end abortion. We also have to have like our faith, because that is what really gives us the reasoning for why every single human is valuable. And so
Mhm.
I appreciate in your book how you're drawing attention to the fact that feminism and Christianity, they conflict with each other. They don't sit well with each other. They don't work well together, even though we try to jam them together. Like, no, it works.
Mhm.
And the women that I have known who are most in favor of feminism, when they look at their lives, if it's feminism versus Christianity, they typically are going to take feminism, which
Mhm.
matches what you talk about in your book about feminism being its own faith and its own church almost. Could you tell
Mhm.
us a little bit about that idea?
Yeah. Um, so no, there's a lot to respond to there for sure. I think one of the things that is I guess I would start by saying that I think is very simple is just to recognize that I think feminism has been the engine for abortion. And I talk about this a great deal in the book, and I'll explain why. But and the reason why the feminism and Christianity cannot work together, and why it hasn't worked to be subsumed in the culture is because of this reality that feminism does create its own idol, which is the female autonomy. This, like we were talking about earlier, this idea of I can do it by myself. My career is the most important thing. I don't need a man. I don't need, resources from other places. I can just do it all on my own because I've got this career. So feminism has created what I've called this shadow church because it's mimicked in a lot of ways Christianity and what what we call kind of the elements of Christianity, whether it's sacraments or commandments or even a means of evangelization, those kinds of elements. And that's, I think, one of the things that is really important for us to just be aware of what is happening on the ground. You know, you mentioned 60 million abortions in the United States alone. Well, there's somewhere between 40 and 70 million abortions worldwide every year. So this is, you know, a massive scale, especially when you consider, you know, what is it? Spain has something like 69 million people. It's like wiping out entirety of Spain every year. You know, this is really awful. And why is it that it's, and this isn't happening with strangers. This is happening with mothers and their own children. I think that's the other reality, or you know, mothers and fathers or grandparents. You know, that this is what's driving this. And how do we get to this place where women are comfortable destroying their own children? I think that's the, you know, the big question, and that's why feminism is so powerful, because it gives us this alternate telos or goal in our life, which is female autonomy. And it tells us that you're going to be weaker if you need a husband. You're going to be weaker if you have children. Your children and your husband are an obstacle to your happiness instead of a means through which you get to it. So that's the idol, or the object of worship, is this female autonomy. And the means, that the important piece of it is work, because that's where women have the means to be able to be autonomous and not have to have a husband. But what gets in the way of work is children. And this is why abortion has to exist, in order to feed this idol, in order for women to really be able to advance in her career, because it's very hard to have a career and, you know, be raising a child or children for a long period of time. So that's really what's feeding it. So it's really this, you know, it's sort of, I think of pro um, life women who are promoting feminism as almost, you know, they're stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time, and they don't realize it, that there's just no progress that can be made. And I think we see this in the pro-life movement at large. You know, we've spent so much time talking about this politically, but what's happened on the cultural level? Well, feminism has taken over this idea of my work, my life, my whatever it is that I want, at the expense of my children. And so that's really why it's such a cultural battle that we haven't fought well, because we've allowed feminism to proliferate. So I think once we figure out as a pro-life movement that feminism is the engine behind this, behind abortion, I think it's going to become a lot easier to actually have a lot more victories, in really understanding, you know, what's the engine behind it, and that's the question that we haven't asked. You know, I think, myself included, I always just thought, well, once you get rid of Roe, then everything is going to be fine, or at least on a state level, you can have some big victories, and I think that's where the challenges have come from, is that we didn't realize Roe wasn't the problem. Feminism is the problem, and this mindset that we've given to women, that we think we're going to be happy in isolation. So yeah, it's really, and I think, as you mentioned too, this is why Christianity is important, to sort of supplant that, like to understand that God and the Trinity and Jesus are the goal to which you know, we need to adhere our lives and focus on, instead of allowing ourselves to really be caught up in a fake faith, or in an idol, that's never going to serve us well. We know what happens when people create idols out of things, and not out and are not focused on God as the true God. It never works out well. It's always a disaster. And you know, I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to give people the real faith, so that they can move forward, instead of, you know, remaining in this very confused world of um, self-worship and focus on, you know, these very peripheral things, instead of what God really wills for our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look at the history of abortion on the global scale, because that's what you were starting to talk about, right? Is that we don't just have a problem with abortion in America, we have a problem
Mm.
with abortion in pretty much every country of the world at this point.
Um,
And so when I started to research like the recent history of abortion, what
mhm,
I found is one of the earliest adopters, I think it's considered the earliest adopter of abortion, is
mhm,
Russia, then known as the USSR. And there are connections between communism and the feminist ideology. There are a lot of ways that they're similar. And it's interesting that that was the very first country to make abortion legal. And
mhm,
then several years later, they had a leader of the country who was like, you know, I need more soldiers, and these women are having abortions, and there aren't enough babies being born, there are not enough soldiers, so we're going to go ahead and ban abortion. And it
Mhm.
was very difficult for them to ban it because the culture had become dependent on abortion. And to this day, Russia has a problem with what they describe as an abortion culture, and they have a higher rate of number of pregnancies and number of abortions versus America. Like we have more live births of all of our pregnancies versus abortions. And so Russia has one of the highest abortion rates in the world as far as how many children are either live born or aborted.
Mhm.
And so it's very sad that when we look at the history of our world, abortion has always been something that has been incredibly damaging. But it does connect deeply to those ideologies, just like you were talking about. Work is the only thing that matters. Work is
Mhm.
the only way I have worth or something to contribute.
Mhm.
And so we have to look so much deeper at the human person and recognize that before God, we are not little workers, that we're his children and that we're made in his image and that our work is not the only thing about us that matters. And many of us have been humbled by seasons of grief or, physical suffering where we maybe can't engage in our work in the way we would like to. And I think one of the reasons God allows us to suffer sometimes is that we correct that ideology that we see a lot in communism and then we see, of course, in feminism, that the only way I have worth is if I'm working. If your body humbles you and you suddenly can't engage in your work in the way you normally could, it's such a reminder that before God, I am a child. God values me because I am his child, not because of work that I can or cannot put out. And so it's really quite sad when we make ourselves just little workers in our minds, because before God, we are beloved children, not merely little workers. And so something I'd like to examine with you, Dr. Gress, is just like we were starting to talk about that the early feminists were told they're so pure-hearted and they're just doing this important work. Something I noticed in your book, The End of Woman, is that you tell the story of a woman who I believe was around the 1700s who
Mhm.
believed feminist ideology, which involved many elements of what later became the sexual revolution.
Mhm.
And she had an early abortion before there were abortionists available, before they even understood the role of
Mhm.
germs and how that could kill women, which I'm not sure I could recall her name.
Mhm.
Is it maybe Simone something or another? Am I going along the right lines here? I might not be, but there was
Um,
an early abortion you describe in that book.
yeah, no, it's I can't think of her name offhand. It's not Simone de Beauvoir. That she came later. It's a long convoluted story from the late 1800s, and it ended up being that it was one of these situations where she had been married, and her husband was bought into this idea of free love, and so he was having all of these affairs, and then she was convinced by her pastor to have an affair with him, and she got pregnant with his child, and then her husband figured out that the child was not his, and so she ended up getting an abortion. I mean, it's really this heartbreaking situation. But yeah, they definitely had abortions available. In fact, the interesting thing I discovered recently was that the YMCA was actually set up because there were so many abortions happening in New York City. You had all these young men that were flocking to New York. They didn't have family, they didn't have any kind of Christian formation, and they were just seducing all these women, and they were having, to perform all these abortions. So this is why the YMCA was set up. And of course, at that time, there were, abortions were absolute, butchery in a certain respect. So, yeah, I think that's the tragedy is we've bought into, as you're saying, the work issue, but what we don't realize is how ideological feminism really is, and how, 1963, you've got Betty Friedan who's saying you need to get out of the home, which she called the comfortable concentration camp, and you need to get into you need to work. And part of the reason that she was doing this, and I was able to trace this in ways that I didn't find elsewhere. I found a lot of evidence about her, but I didn't find this connection anywhere else than what I was able to find. Was that she was following Engels, who was the colleague of Karl Marx, who wanted, didn't believe that home was a place of production, and they wanted people to be doing productive work outside the home. And so what Friedan did, which was really interesting, was she created the sense of the fear of missing out, that women already have. She sort of, poked at that, and also really trying to denigrate the home. And that was her effort at contributing to the communist revolution that she was hoping would happen in the United States. She was very much a part of an underground communist effort, and so it's really fascinating when you look at these connections. I think to the ideological, and how that there was so much more happening than just, some women with some nice intentions that were trying to liberate women. And back to the sexual revolution, same thing. There was a book written in 1936 called The Sexual Revolution by a leftist thinker named Wilhelm Reich. And he very much influenced people like Kate Millett and Angela Davis, who were all for the sexual revolution and this idea that women needed to be promiscuous just in the same way that men are. And in order for that to happen, you have to have contraception, you have to have abortion available. So you can really see that the deep damage that is done because we're trying to make the same two things that are totally not the same. Men and women are obviously very different, and I think this is the why we see so much brokenness in women. So much, and this is that, what has really motivated me as well is to see fundamentally feminism hasn't made women happier. We see just huge numbers of anxiety, depression, suicide, divorce, substance abuse. All of these things point to some incredibly unhappy women, and that I think that's all of it is because we're trying to force women into this model of being like men, instead of really honoring women as women. And, I think another thing the pro-life movement could do exceptionally well and exceptionally easy is just start talking about the real virtues and gifts of motherhood. Again, not just merely biological, but we haven't talked about this. We've opened up this space in the culture for motherhood to be denigrated for 50 years, and we haven't said positive things about it. We don't have characters that we can point to in television and media, maybe more than a handful of moms that we look at and say, that's a really amazing model that I want to follow and become like in my life. And absent those kinds of models, women just don't even have the kind of mental structure to be able to think outside the box of what the distortions of culture have offered us. So anyway, I think we need to just first of all be aware of the ideology and the way that we're being influenced. Second of all, recognize that we are not free thinkers as we think we are. I think that's this idea of the romantic lie that we are making our own choices based on our individual intellectual capacities. Most of the choices that women make are being influenced by the wider culture. So we have to be aware of that. And then the third thing is more positive, which is getting back to understanding who and what women are and why that's important, not what we do, but what we are. And even just the capacity the woman has. Few of us know that a woman, when she is ordered and peaceful and calm, has the capacity to actually reset the nervous system of a husband, of her children. That's something that's really amazing. That I only just learned this recently, but people don't talk about this. They don't understand the role that plays, and that capacity that women have to do something so important as being a gift, a calming presence and a gift, and a real reset to others. I think is really important. So yeah, you can see how thorny these issues are and how connected and interrelated they are. But when you start seeing, I think, the bigger picture, it's then easier to sort of map onto what do I as an individual woman need to do to be able to promote a culture of life and to push out this negative ideological thinking that's been so foisted upon us as a culture. And that's what's creating the problems. Not the fact that we're women, but the fact that we have tried to erase that reality of our womanhood.
Mm. Yeah, one thing I noticed in your book, Something Wicked, you talk about how many people noticed with the earlier onset of feminism that feminism was encouraging women to take on some of men's less healthy traits. So, encouraging women to be more aggressive. And it's just so interesting because as I read that insight in your book, I was like, oh, that's what I've seen in the women I know who are
Mhm.
trying to be feminists, is that they are more hostile, more aggressive, less modest, because they think modesty is inherently oppressing their body, less full of grace to others, less kind, and just in general believing that some of these traits that we associate with women, like modesty and grace and kindness and nurturing, believing those are inherently oppressive and that they came from the patriarchy.
Right.
Very interesting because one of the quotes you include in your book, it's from, I believe it was either a priest or someone who had just observed in the culture that we believe now, because of feminism and its influence, that women need to take on these traits of aggressiveness and leave their kindness and their thoughtfulness, their ability to nurture and help people grow, and instead to become these aggressive, rough women. In so
Mhm.
doing, we hurt so many people and we lose that unique ability we have to bring
Yeah.
life, not only through obviously bearing life, but through
Right.
being a life-giving person in your relationships, just completely losing that, which is a tragedy that we would trade that. And so I think one question that I would like to ask you as we wrap up here is this is something that comes up so much in the pro-life movement, is I hear quite frequently that we can separate the sexual revolution as some event that happened over here, and then feminism is its own little ideology thing that happened over here. They may cross paths a little, but if they do, it's not intentional. Feminism is its own thing. It can be very pure and very good. Could you help our listeners understand the connection between the sexual revolution and feminism, and why abortion exists today in our culture and why we depend so much on contraception?
Mhm. Okay, two things. Yeah, I first want to just address the emotional part because I think that's really important. The one thing that the church has the virtues of faith, hope, and love, and I think feminism has its opposite, has anger, contempt, and envy. And that's not by accident. That's actually was very intentional in the 1890s. You had the socialists who realized that women are much more politically active and effective if they're mad. And so this is really where the idea of consciousness raising came from, which is they were these groups. They were formed in the largely in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. They kind of fell out of favor, but these were but they started in the 1890s, and then they were used around the world in Maoist China, and so by the time it came back to the United States, people thought it was this exotic Chinese thing. But basically, it's a group of people get together and they just talk about the things that they're upset about, and it's not meant to heal. It's not meant to be a way forward. It's absolutely meant to just make people angry. And then not only are you angry about your own things, but you're also angry about everybody else's things in the group. So it's intentionally meant to foment envy and contempt and rage in women. And I think that that hasn't gone away. We still see that in the culture today. Obviously, social media has been like adding a match to a tinderbox by really encouraging that and creating, sort of models for women to follow that somehow it looks appealing or is compelling to be this angry, bitter, righteous, gotcha moment kind of woman. And I think, gratefully, people are finally getting tired of it. There's a certain amount of exhaustion that just sets in when you're around people like this. And I know I went through my own stage in my own life where I had to address this because I realized I had taken on a lot of these elements. So I think that's a huge key piece that we have to start dealing with. But the second point that you brought up was the sexual revolution and feminism being separate entities. They're actually the same entity. They're actually really an effort to undermine the family and faith in the culture. They were very intentionally done together. People in the promoters of communism recognized that you could not come into the United States and conquer the United States with the communist revolution the way that was done in Russia. People would just never absorb it, but it could be done very practically. And this is where someone like Kate Millett comes in by trying to undermine the role of the families, especially the father figure. If you can take away his authority, then you can destroy the family. And the way in which you do that is through things like sexual promiscuity, sexual license. All the LGTB movements that we've seen have been part and parcel of this. So I don't think you can actually separate them out. And in fact, the sexual revolution was very much working in tandem with the feminist ideas because fundamentally they both believed that the family and faith were problematic. So as soon as again, I think when you recognize what's happened philosophically in the way this that we've been really, I think, manipulated into believing that these things are good or could be made good, even by people with great intentions. I think there's some very well-intended people, but they just don't really realize that the fire that they're playing with. I think that it becomes much easier to start rebuilding when you just let go of these things entirely and say, there's not been any good fruit here. This isn't helping us. This isn't getting us to the place where we need to be. We need to abandon this and really start getting back to some basic um, Christian principles and talking about womanhood in another way. And I think the other thing that happens with feminism, other people have said, well, why don't we just come up with a different name for it? I think at the heart of it, feminism and its ideology wants women to see themselves as victims, and men are the victimizers. And in fact, I think this is part of the problem because the biggest victims in the culture today are actually children, because of what we've done to women. But we don't see people saying, "Oh, well, we need, childism or something." I think the piece that we need to correct in our minds is this idea that women are victims, just in our being. Yes, we have absolutely vulnerabilities, and those need to be protected and provided for. But the best way to do that is not by having the state step in and fill in the gaps. It's by having men be good men and protecting and caring for their wives, especially in that greatest point of vulnerability, which is when we're having children and raising children. So moving away from this idea that somehow the state or this victimhood status is going to work for us, I think is also a real, an important point. And if we drop the language of feminism, that kind of gets built in, because you have to start speaking in much more precise language and clear terms, because feminism has captured so much and it means so many different things to different people, that it's allowed this kind of intellectual confusion that I think has not served us well. So anyway, I hope that if I hope I didn't miss something to your question, but I think um, clarifying our own thoughts on this can go a long way in moving forward, and that's what I've really obviously tried to do in my books is help women and men in certainly in the pro-life movement, um, kind of unravel this so that we aren't continually, chasing our tails or, like I said earlier, pressing the gas and the brake simultaneously, but we can actually finally get the pro-life movement and the pro-life message seeded, reworked back into the culture, in the ways that we've just been missing for 50 years now.
Absolutely. And your book is so interesting for that reason in particular, is that we don't necessarily even know what we mean by the word feminism. And you argue in your book that many people mean many different things, and sometimes we don't actually want to know what history says
Right.
about what feminism actually is. And so I think in some ways it's actually an intellectually lazy position
Mm.
to promote feminism, but to not know where it came from, or to say that somehow we can protect it or redeem it, but we still haven't been very honest with ourselves about who were the first wave feminists, who were these founders, what kind of lives were they living, what kind of fruit have they produced.
Yeah.
And that's why I think people should pick up your book, The End of Woman, and they should read Something Wicked so that we can go deeper and we could actually understand what was the first wave of feminism and what are the results, because we never ask that. We believe that feminism is somehow above questioning, which I think is extraordinarily unhealthy, because we know that in general someone is a great leader and an ideology is a great ideology when it can be questioned and it can be defended in a way that is robust and healthy. But if feminism can't even defend itself and
Mm.
has to, gaslight people into saying, how could you question this? Or, if we can't even have a genuine intellectual conversation about it without being told, well, we must be against women and we must want to destroy women, that's a sign that there's something lacking here. There's something about feminism that it's not living up to what it claims it will do for our culture. So thank you
Yeah.
so much, Dr. Gress, for allowing us to discuss this extremely important issue. Would you share with our listeners where they can find you if they want to learn more about you or read your books?
Yeah, so the best place is probably, I have a website, carriegress.com. I'm also really active on Instagram. It's carrie.gress there. And then I have a blog called Theology of Home, over at Substack. So you can just go to theologyofhome.com and that will eventually take you to the Substack. You can link to it there. But that's the best place to find out what I'm up to, and I think that theology of home in general, just as an idea, has been really important. It's something that I've worked on a great deal because I think that women um, have been really distorted by popular content, things like Cosmo and magazines, and so we as pro-lifers haven't done a good job of creating content that women really want to get their hands on or want to read. And so I've got a series of books that are really rich and talk about the home and kind of the theological connections to it, why the home is meant to be a sanctuary, why it really is meant to be a foretaste of heaven and what that means. But also just on a daily basis, I publish every day of the week, at theologyofhome.substack.com, just content for women to try to help edify us and inspire us to really understand what womanhood means and how we can live that out in our daily lives on all the practical levels as well. And I think this is another key piece is getting back into the culture and helping women understand the richness and the beauty instead of, constantly feeling like we need to apologize for our faith or somehow believing in the incredible gift that it is to be a woman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grass. I'm so grateful you could join us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.